click one more button here, and then we're off and running on YouTube. So, Dooovid, we often talk about Jewish and Israeli issues and how they intersect with politics and culture and America. One thing I wanted to mention this week is the sort of the kerfuffle, if you will, the controversy with Tucker Carlson and the ADL. Now, I want to be careful here because I know that it's tricky business criticizing the ADL. You know, they kind of have a big hand in what YouTube is censoring these days. In fact, you and I actually did a program that was censored on my station. It's one of the few that I actually got a strike for it. And I don't know, did they think that that either you or I are anti-Semitic? I don't know. We're both devout Jews. I mean, relatively. We're both relatively pro-Israel. I mean, who knows what it was that triggered it? But I understand that the ADL has a major hand in that. So I want to proceed carefully here and mention that they tried to get Tucker Carlson fired because I think he said something about criticizing a hypocrisy within the Jewish community, which supports strong national defense and borders for the state of Israel, but not so much for the United States. And I think that the head of the ADL, Greenblatt, actually went on a program and compared this with white supremacy and claimed that Carlson should be fired for this. And Tucker Carlson, as is his habit, came back with guns a-blazing. I mean, he doubled down and he said, look, he showed a document on the ADL website, which says that Israel should never be put in a position to have to tolerate influx of illegal aliens into its borders because to do so could threaten the national identity of the Jewish state and the numbers of Jews in Israel and other same such ideas, with Carlson saying, well, you know, if you're going to take that position for Israel, why is it that you're a supporter of open borders for the United States? So I guess, Dooovid, what do you make of this?
I mean, it's not surprising. And I mean, we've talked about, you know, the ADL and the role that they play. And, you know, obviously there's less sectarianism between Judaism. The ADL is an official, you know, AIPAC member group. Most federations work together or, you know, have joint work together with the ADL. You know, obviously, you know, it's hard to, you know, say the ADL is not representative of Judaism when they're one of the most official Jewish organizations in America. And we talked about the censorship strategy. But there's also the funding, and we also talked about that recent book Berman wrote on the Jewish philanthropic industrial complex, where, you know, really there's a handful of mega wealthy people that fund the majority of these Jewish charities, and to some extent, the Jewish organizations like the ADL work on behalf of individual Jewish interests who donate money. I even have Jonathan Greenblatt, when he came to Detroit, said that he considers his donors his shareholders. He has a background in Silicon Valley, in Starbucks, and you know, different things. And he said he looked at the ADL like a company and shareholders. And to some extent, you could see, like, yeah, probably the shareholders, the people who give the major donations to the ADL, want to take Fox down. And there's probably a majority of American Jews, you know, I'm going to call want to take Fox down, but, you know, saying if the ADL could get Tucker Carlson fired, that probably does speak for the people that give a large sums of money, mostly in Silicon Valley, to the ADL, and for Jewish organizations heads. And also, you know, as we mentioned, immigration is basically the biggest mismatch issue between the larger Jewish community and the larger American community, where, you know, generally Jews are overwhelmingly in support of more liberal immigration policies, and even right-wing Jews, Trump-supporting Jews, generally are more liberal on immigration than non-Jews. that that is the ADL being weaponized in the immigration debate, where they're using anti-Semitism in order to kind of bolster their position on immigration, where Tucker Carlson, maybe, he's probably not an anti-Semite. Tucker Carlson, I wouldn't be surprised that probably like 1 out of 4 of his friends are Jewish. And there's almost no way that, he's an anti-Semite like Sean Hannity, or I mean, Tucker Carlson maybe is a little more controversial than Sean Hannity in that matter. But just strategically, that Jewish organizations that are very active in promoting immigration are just going to hit you with anti-Semitism as a way to win the debate on immigration. I think that's pretty clear. Like, it's not clear to
Well,
most Jewish organizations or heads or a lot of liberal Jews you would speak to. But I think objectively on the side, you would agree that, the ADL is basically, a hitman for a certain interest. They do represent probably the majority opinion democratically of the Jews, but in this case, they're basically a hitman.
I couldn't agree more. And I think that it goes to actually, quite frankly, the contention made by Dr. E. Michael Jones, which, while I don't agree with Dr. Jones's motivations in that contention or his conclusions, nevertheless, sometimes people get it right. And his complaint with regard to the ADL is that they're going to call anything that isn't a liberal left-wing cause anti-Semitic. And for example, I mean, if you oppose abortion, if you oppose gay marriage, if you oppose transhumanism or transgenderism or whatever they're calling it, then you're anti-Semitic. And you oppose open borders, you're anti-Semitic. Anything, they're going to look at anything. And I think this goes to what you're saying with regard to the fact that they are a creature of their big donors, and their big donors, who predominantly are very, very wealthy Jews, are people of the left. They are people, they're socialists. They don't really, have much of an inkling of what the Jewish covenant is. You know what I mean? They tend to be leftists. Now, having said that, I think that the ADL should be commended on one particular issue that I will be clear about, and that is that they are pretty staunch supporters of the state of Israel. So, I will say that at least on that score, they're on the right side. But when they poke their nose into all of these social issues that really are not necessarily, and I would contend, are not consistent with Judaic understanding.
What about democratically? I mean, they do speak on behalf of the majority of American Jews, probably.
Doesn't matter. They're not speaking on behalf of Jewish faith.
But I mean, democratically, we're a democracy, and the ADL does generally represent the opinion of the majority of American Jews, whether that has anything to do with Torah or not.
Therefore, as some kind of a definitive spokesperson on Judaism and what's not anti-Jewish, let them be what they are then. Let them turn into the anti-defamation against leftism and against communism, instead of trying to claim that they represent Judaism. And same thing for all these left-wing.
Well, the point I'm making, they do represent, democratically, they do represent Judaism.
No, they represent ultra-liberal fat cat Jews.
But I mean, democratically,
even if most of the Jews go along with that, and I agree with you, they do. Doesn't matter. The thing is, most Jews probably are not kosher. It doesn't make kosher laws invalid. Right? I mean, I'm just saying that they don't represent the general covenant between God and the children of Israel. They don't represent the Torah. They don't represent the Talmud. They represent modern social culture, which most Jews embrace. And most Jews are not particularly religious. I doubt if most Jews even believe in God. And, look, that's their right. That's fine. But I think that it's misleading for them to claim that they represent somehow, or even imply that they represent Judaism itself. They represent Sabbatian Frankist Judaism, if I can be really blunt. They don't represent conventional Judaism. And most Jews in this country do go along with that, at least subconsciously. And I don't think most Jews in this country understand what Judaism is, nor do they care.
Well, that's the benefit of America.
Defending abortion and gay marriage and all the other social causes that the left supports. And so that's my criticism here. And they're creatures of the wealthy fat cat people. I don't think it's quite fair to single them out for that, because I think you're going to find that's true in any group that's nonprofit, any philanthropic, whether it calls self Christian or Jewish or otherwise. They do tend to kowtow to their big donors. They're raising money, and they're not going to take a position that goes against those donors. I mean, I think that's fair, and that should be stated.
Well, I mean, I say I have the ADL. I know the local leaders of my ADL. I have a picture, on my Facebook profile of Jonathan Greenblatt. He came to Detroit, and theologically, like we talk about Talmud and Orthodoxy, but I would say unquestionably, the ADL is democratically representative of what a majority of Jews in America believe. And obviously, there's fat cats and there's donors, but that's general Judaism. And in Detroit, its prime example is that the ADL doesn't get invited to speak in Orthodox synagogues. There are a few Chabad that will work with the ADL, but the ADL, speaks and does events at all the liberal synagogues. And Jonathan Greenblatt, when he came to Detroit, filled
Dooovid, you're breaking up on me. You're having a technical problem. Maybe the ADL might be putting a SIM card or whatever it is that they did with those Michigan machines. I don't know, to go online. I'm not going to go into that. Don't worry. But anyways, Dooovid, I hope you can come back. I have you up here.
the theater.
You're breaking up on me, Dooovid. I don't know what's going on with your computer. Maybe.
Okay, I think I got my internet, for whatever reason, my connection died out. I apologize about that, especially
okay.
the listeners. But I was just mentioning that, no, I mean, the ADL, although, Judaism, like the Berman book about the philanthropic industrial complex, is skewed towards the benefit of donors. But the majority of Judaism does not care about our tradition. They care about our interests, and the collective interest of Jews, according to the way that Jews ourselves see it, is in line with the ADL. Just give examples.
First of all,
like here in Metro Detroit, the ADL is one of the most prominent of any organization.
But how is it that Jewish interests are served by supporting abortion and gay marriage and transhumanism or whatever this is? I mean, how is that something? I mean, that benefits the left, and we could go into why, and open borders and other such policies and big government and all the other things they like. But it doesn't reflect.
If you argue internally about what Judaism means,
and most of the people that support that don't give a damn about Judaism anyways, even if they are.
Yeah, but we're in a democracy. What about polling and voting? We're saying, like, we know the polling. We know, if you ask, we have all this data about how Jews feel about immigration, abortion, and even religion. And Jews don't really care that much about religion and what it is to be authentic. And Jews care a lot about issues like immigration and abortion. So the ADL is representative of what Jews care about.
Let me give another example here, and it's an imperfect one, but I would probably guess that the majority of Roman Catholics don't care about abortion either, or gay marriage. But it runs against the doctrine of their faith. It runs against the Pope and the cardinals and the college, the Catholic tradition. Do they want to see that? Would they call themselves the Catholics who support abortion? It's, in other words, fine. So they do. But, are they going to pretend that position is consonant with Catholicism?
But I mean, Jews aren't pretending. We have Jewish federations and official organizations. There is no, a Catholic federation that pushes these liberal ideas. There might be a few groups, but Jews are extremely well organized. We have official federations and AIPAC.
I know that.
And we've done our polling and voting, and this is what we believe. And you, as right-wing Jews, could say, there's a problem. We believe wrong, but we should at least admit that, yes, this is an accurate.
It is what they believe, and look, you and I agree about that. Most Jews are leftists. Most Jews are socialists to varying degrees, and I mean, I'm troubled by that very deeply. But that is the fact on the ground. That doesn't therefore make it particularly Jewish. Would they decide that ham is kosher? I mean, probably most Jews have.
Because Jewish is what Jews do. So if Jews do a non-Jewish thing, it's still kind of Jewish. I mean, we could argue about that all day, but Judaism is what Jews do, not necessarily what our books or text or rabbis say.
No, that's untrue. It's
Well, in your opinion, by saying there is a,
no, I mean, if
I
a
mean,
Jew
you're
is
not even acknowledging that it's okay to say
if a
Judaism is
Jew
what
is
Jews
having
do.
a ham sandwich at the Bema, that isn't Jewish.
Yeah,
Now
but
they
that's
could,
not what Jews do. I'm saying that Jews eat ham.
but you're saying they would support something that runs contrary to Judaic faith. It isn't. It's what they do, but it doesn't make it something that's consonant with the faith. And I think that I'm not disputing their right to do whatever the hell they want to do in this country.
Yeah, but I mean,
America,
just making the point that they're federations, there's groups, there's organizations that's job is to speak on behalf of Jews, and this is what they say. And so you could
well, you know
argue all day
something. Maybe they should
that's
qualify.
not Jewish, but what are you going to say? Like, oh, the Jewish
No,
Federation has to change its name.
no,
It can't be the
what
Jewish,
I would,
but it's like no,
I
because
think
the
they
Jewish
need to be.
Federation is representative of what Jews
Yeah,
do.
I think they ought to be more honest and say we represent liberals who happen to have a Jewish background. Don't claim to speak for Judaism itself,
Why
and
can't they
don't claim to speak
represent the
for all of
majority of
Jews.
Jews when they do? I'm saying the Federation, if they
Not the
factually represent
majority
the
of Jews.
majority of Jews, why shouldn't they say they factually represent the majority
Yeah,
of
but they
Jews?
could put a little disclaimer in there. They could say, and the majority of Jews are socialists, like
But I mean,
we,
why should they? He was saying if you were the
because it's
majority, why would
honest,
you put a disclaimer? I'm saying
because
factually
it
they
would be
represent.
honest. That's why. Because I like honesty and I like transparency. They represent the majority of Jews who no longer care about Judaism, who are socialists and who care about other issues outside of Judaism that have nothing to do with Judaism, like abortion, for example. It's if they want to do that, fine. I want to see some. First of all, I'd like them to be honest about where they are and who they are, and be willing to discuss it without making accusations that anybody that doesn't genuflect to their view as an anti-Semite. And secondly, I'd like to see a little bit more actual literal pluralism in that they would allow the fact that a reasonably large number of Jews, and in fact, a growing number of Jews, do not see it the way they do. You just said Orthodox synagogues don't don't invite ADL to speak at their events. I mean, aren't they Jews? I mean, what the hell?
What I mean is that ADL, like I know because ADL wants to speak to Orthodox groups, and the Orthodox groups are
And not
from.
welcoming, yeah, because they don't represent them. They're not. Oops, sorry, getting a little crank call there. Anyway,
Yeah, I mean, it's the problem with the problem. What I mentioned of being anti-Zionist, you said, look, obviously, I dedicated my whole life to Israel, conceptually Israel and Judaism. Although you could call me anti-Zionist, you could maybe even could call me anti the state of Israel in certain ways. But that's the flaw of Zionism: is you can't speak on behalf of Judaism. And if you're going to take Zionism, well, let's just do a democracy, and that's what it is. We did a vote, and this is what the majority of Jews believe.
Dooovid, I didn't realize that you're anti-Zionist.
Well, I mean, you could call me that in a certain way. I mean,
are you?
Well, yeah, because I favor a one-state solution and giving Palestinian citizenship, which most Israelis would probably consider
Do
anti-Semitic.
you favor the existence of a Jewish state?
I mean, you could, if you forced me in a certain way, I would probably say, no, I don't think the state of Israel is a good idea. I'm not actively like doing things to oppose it, but I would say this as a religious Jew who thinks I have a vision of, really what my rabbis taught me. I'm not telling you anything that I wasn't, taught by my rabbis, but I was saying like, yeah, if you called me anti-Zionist, and that's one of the complaints that, you as a logical person, that's the fallacy of Zionism, because Zionism has to be democracy, and it doesn't have to be, but if you're going to have a Zionist democracy, it has to be a democracy. And if the majority of Jews decide that we want to change Judaism, you can't be like, no, you must keep Judaism exactly as it is. We're a democracy. So in America, it seems perfectly logical that this is the way it's working. The poll data is clear, the history is clear, and it's just the democratic capitalistic process at work. And you say, okay, we're a minority among a minority, so we're a minority as Jews, and we're a minority among minority as Republican Jews. And you would say, oh, the Jewish Federation doesn't speak for us, but they do. And just like Israel doesn't speak for us, they do, even though we might be minority dissenting.
I suppose you could say that if you're anti-Zionist, and I should have known that about you, Dooovid, from talking to you in the past, then in that sense, you would be, I would argue, against the general grain of the Jewish faith. And in that sense, that's
I was taught this in Jerusalem at yeshiva. Like, I didn't come up with this stuff on my own. That's what they taught me in yeshiva in Jerusalem.
However it happened. And in that sense, I think the ADL is more Jewish because they are pro-Israel. Israel has a right to exist as a Jewish state. And it's it's
like the Notori Karta. They don't have their right to say that. Like, okay, so what's the difference between me and you and the Notori Karta? I mean, we're not as minority as Notori Karta, but if the ADL and the Federation are saying that basically, Dooovid and Charles are Notori Karta.
Well, they're not going to. I'm not. Maybe you are. I'm not. What you mean? We Kemosabe?
Well, I mean, you're just some dissenting person who doesn't represent anybody and is causing problems because they know that they're dealing with the majority opinion of the Jews.
Well, I don't think it's a matter of majority opinion. I mean, I would argue, even though it is in the case of Israel, I would argue that the Jewish claim to statehood in Israel is the superior claim. And I would argue it on many different fronts. Not that the Palestinian claim or the Arab claim or the non-Jewish claim doesn't have its points, but I would suggest that in the bigger argument, the Jewish claim is the better claim, is a superior claim.
Well, as I mentioned, the Notori Karta.
And I think that my position on that is consistent with not only you want to talk about majority opinion, I mean, the majority of Jews around the world and in this country, but it's also consistent with Jewish faith and Jewish covenants. The Notori Karta is a fringe minority group. They have a right to their opinion. And, but, to my way of thinking, they're not taking a hard enough look at their own scriptures. I mean, I'm not a rabbi. I don't claim to be. But it seems to me that the Jew every day prays toward a return to the land that God showed Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The entire Torah is about the experience and the sojourn of the people as it relates to that little tiny swath of land. Now, why it is that God chose that land, why it is that God defined it in the book of Deuteronomy by very specific borders, as in between the Mediterranean Sea and the Jordan River, I have no idea. That's only God knows. I'm not God. I mean, God designates it in the Torah. But if you believe in the Torah and you believe the Torah comes from God, and I think that the Notori Karta does claim that they do, then
we don't have to rehash the anti-Zionist argument. But I'm saying
I don't understand
when you say the ADL and the Federation are not authentic Judaism, and you admit they represent the democratic majority.
Well, I made
that's
this
in essence what Notori Karta is saying. They're saying Zionism is not authentic Judaism. I don't care if every single Jew in Israel believes that Zionism is authentic. They're going to hell. They're wrong. That's not the correct interpretation of the books. And so that's basically what you're saying. The Reform and conservative movement that makes up the backbone of the Federation. You're saying they're not authentic. But you're saying they're not. You're saying Reform and conservative. They're not authentic.
No, I didn't. I'm not.
But you're saying that they're not representative of authentic. You're saying the Federations and the ADL don't have rabbinic guidance.
I did not comment on Reform and conservative, and I did not say they're not authentic.
But I mean, they're the rabbinic guidance of the Federations.
I don't know.
And the ADL.
I have no idea what kind of rabbinic guidance they get. But I was very clear when I started this conversation that on the issue of supporting the Jewish people's right to sovereignty in the land that God promised us, they are consistent with the Jewish covenant. And I could point to...
In your opinion. I mean, you're not even willing to say in your opinion. I'm telling you, like, I didn't go to Notori Karta school. I went to Mir Yeshiva, and they taught me that Zionism wasn't right.
Don't interrupt me on this. I could point to almost every sentence in the Torah, which I do believe came from God. I believe God put his hand out of the clouds, and he handed the entire Torah to Moses at Sinai. And that Torah is all about Israel and taking possession of that land. From the very first word.
We've argued this 100 times. I'm just saying that I didn't learn this from Notori Karta. I learned this in Mir Yeshiva, the most prominent yeshiva in Jerusalem that refuses to fly in an Israeli flag.
Look, Dooovid, this isn't me saying this.
That's not me saying either. Like, I was in Mir Yeshiva and heard of it. We refused to fly an Israeli flag.
Well, that's their business. But I could pull out the Torah right now as we talk and read to you the quotes that are filled and infused within it that call for the Jewish people, however, whether they're holy or not. I know they complain that the modern Jews are not holy enough. I get that, but and I don't necessarily
Yeah, I mean, my
disagree.
liberal rabbis do the same
But
thing
the
with
point is
immigration. If
that
you go to an ADL or
however it
immigration
comes
event, they're
about,
quoting the Torah
the
too.
Lord God, King of the universe, commanded us to take possession of that tiny piece of land. This isn't me saying this. They say it every day when they daven. It's in the prayer.
It's your interpretation of
I'm
Judaism,
interpreting. It's in black and white.
or you name a rabbi. I'm saying,
I
I'm telling you,
you
I
know
went to
what?
the best school in Jerusalem, and it wasn't Torah Karta, and that's what they taught me.
I'm
Which
going to
rabbi are you quoting
I'm going
from?
to take out the
If you
Bible,
tell me, Rabbi Koch,
and I'm going to show you in Leviticus where it talks about how the Jews are to take possession of that land. Okay,
yeah, I mean, but Jews
I didn't
don't
realize
follow the
you have to
Jews
go
don't follow
through
the
such a-
scripture. Jews
such a
follow the
big-
rabbis.
The rabbis, I assume, are not dismoored of the scriptures,
Yeah, I'm saying that these rabbis know all those. I mean, we don't have to rehash the argument. I was making the point about what does it mean to speak on behalf of Jews?
I mean, I think that didn't Moses send the spies into Canaan? Wasn't Canaan Israel? So they could find out whether or not they could enter. Didn't Joshua tumble the walls of Jericho in Israel? So
It's
that
funny you hold a Christian Bible.
It's
God forbid it's funny you're reading a Christian Bible.
not well, I guess it is. It's King James, but I don't have. I mean, I have plenty of Jewish. I have plenty of the Jewish Bibles. I haven't.
Well, I don't want to rehash the Zionism argument. I'm giving a comparison where you're saying that that's not authentic Judaism, the ADL and the federations and
I just don't understand how
abortion,
it is that
but they have their rabbis. They quote the
I'm
Torah.
sure they do.
They have their.
How is it that they go and daven every day and are so pious and are claiming that they represent a closeness to God and that they know God and that they read the Torah every day, or at least on Shabbos and 2 or 3 times a week, and they daven and they read the 3 times prayers, which say next year, up to Zion, up to Israel, and
this was, I believe, in the land of Israel, the government. So if you take the position of Mir Yeshiva, that we like, I studied in Jerusalem. I believe in Israel. I took the best years of my life to study in Jerusalem. But if I tell you that I'm against the state of Israel, and that was, I mean, what does it mean to be against the state in a certain way?
It's perfectly fine and perfectly legitimate, actually, to be critical of Israel.
So that was what the rabbis would say. They say the Zionists are evil, horrible people.
I know, it's horrible.
But Israel is still the Holy Land, and we still believe in all this stuff. It's just saying those people in charge of the government, they're horrible, evil people.
Well, then let them elect good, better people. I mean, I would.
That's what's happening. Democracy. You see, the Haredim are increasing.
And Israel does have a Knesset. They do have a system by which
so why don't you accept that here in America with the ADL and the Federation?
Well, wait a minute. What do you mean? I mean, the ADL has a right politically in the United States to represent whatever they want.
Well, I know the Reform group that decides our positions on issues, and I'll say our because I was bar mitzvah Reform. I'm not a member of Reform, but they have a democratic process of over 2 million people that they go through and decide what their opinion is going to be on issues. And they went through that process and decided their opinions on abortion and immigration, and it's representative of 2 million Jews in America. More than the total of all Orthodox Jews, more than double the total of all Orthodox Jews in America.
I mean, do they declare ham kosher, or they don't care about that?
Well, I mean, that wasn't one of their issues. I'm saying, that they did declare. I mean, they didn't declare ham kosher, but there was a meeting and they declared that they served ham, they served shrimp.
Yeah,
that was the famous meeting that split between Reform and Conservative. But I was saying that it wasn't like they did have a democratic process of the federations and these committees, and these opinions that the ADL represents is pretty factually representative of the majority of American Jews. So I'm just pushing back on you. Like in Israel, you're like, oh, democracy is so wonderful. But in America, you don't think democracy is so wonderful. You think that we should have to listen to the rabbis. That's not authentic Judaism. You don't get to vote and decide what it means to be a Jew. You have to listen to the authentic Judaism.
In America, they can vote for their own representatives and senators and governors and mayors.
And Jewish federations. And
Jewish federations, look, in a way, first of all,
And most Jewish federations aren't
I
that
am not
democratic.
opposed.
Unfortunately, most federations aren't that democratic,
Yeah,
but
and
some of them
I'm
are a
not
little.
opposed to reform and conservative Judaism per se. I mean, I davened at a conservative synagogue, and I was bar mitzvahed also in a reform synagogue, and that actually is my background. But I do think that it's problematic for the same reason that it's problematic for the ADL, for reform administration, if you will, the federation, to poke their nose into issues that have nothing to do with Judaism, but have everything to do with liberal politics, and claim that this is now a part of their Jewish faith. If
It
they
is because
want
that's
to
what
do
Jews
that,
want them to do.
well, they shouldn't get it. If they want to do that, then they can join the Socialist Union
No,
of
it's a
America.
democracy. The Jews want Jewish representative. They don't want to do that under the guise of socialism or democracy. They want to
But
do it
that's what
under
they're
the guise of
advocating.
Judaism.
They're subverting and changing Judaism to fit their image, which is a
Well, you're
socialist.
using a pejorative, but like even if I accept your pejorative,
No,
say yes, so what? Yes, so what? That's their
let
right to
them
do.
form a
That's their right to
socialist. By the way,
democratically.
there are socialist Jewish groups. I don't have a problem with that are openly so, like the Workmen's Circle,
Yeah, I
right?
mean that's why I'm in America. My grandfather's grandfather is a rabbi for the Workmen's Circle.
Yeah, and I don't have a problem with that. Humanistic Judaism, fine. But don't claim to speak,
Well,
as
why not? Why can't Jews collectively get together and vote? This is what we believe, even if it contradicts what a bunch of ancient books or Orthodox rabbis say. And you're saying like, no, you don't get to vote against the scripture or what the Orthodox rabbis are saying, and saying
well, I
the
just
vast
don't think
majority
that.
of American Jews disagree with you,
Well, look,
and they want to be able to speak as Jews in their areas of interest, even though it's completely against historically what our books and Orthodox
and
rabbis say.
theologically. Look, they can do whatever they want. I'm simply pointing out that it's no more their purview to do that
Well, it
and
is. I'm
claim
saying, why
that
is it
they
not their purview to
represent
speak as
Judaism.
Jews according to however they see fit? Just like New Square. You're saying New Square might be 100% wrong as Judaism, but they have the right to live their life as they see fit.
And
So to reform and liberal Jews have the right to organize as Jews as they see fit.
they do have a right to do so. I just resent the idea that, particularly the ADL more so, but that other Jewish groups would claim to speak for authentic Judaism. Let them have their
Well, no, they're
socialist.
speaking against. We know what the Orthodox Jews and what our books say. And the reason why Jews are doing it is because they want the Goyim and the larger society to know that that's not what Jews believe. Jews is a collective. We don't care what those books say. I mean, we might care and respect them, but like, no, we're not coming to try to get what those books say. We're not trying to get what a bunch of Orthodox rabbis saying. These are the issues we care about as a Jewish community. And we know full well that every Orthodox rabbi and thousands of quotes from those books are in direct contradiction to that. And you say that's something wrong. And I say like, well, maybe they're going to hell. Maybe there's a God and it makes a difference. But in practical purpose, like that's their right. I don't see any problem. Why can't they, why are you
You know what,
against that?
Dooovid? I'm not saying, first of all, I'm not saying anybody's going to hell. Only God knows that. And I don't make those kinds of claims, unlike some people. But, I'm simply saying that they are subverting Judaism when they do this, and deliberately so. And it's a problem that goes all the way back to, Shabtai Zvi, in my opinion. It's an attempt to take the very basic foundation of Judaism and its moral and ethical precepts, which are derived from the Torah and from millennia of study by legitimate scholars and scribes and rabbis, and they're going to turn it on its head because they don't like the way it fits into their views today. Now, I'm not disputing the fact that they have a right to those views, especially in this country. We have a free country here. I'm simply saying that they're involved in a deception, even within themselves, and that, yeah, they probably do represent a majority of people who call themselves Jews. And it's in a way I do compare it to, maybe our problem is we don't have a pope. We don't have a central authority now. We don't have a temple. We don't have a high priest. We don't have a Sanhedrin. We don't have the kind of infrastructure that we had in Roman times where you really did have an authority. And, so you can have different people come up and say, oh, well, I represent. So we have to look to the thousands of years of wisdom from the sages and try to adhere to that. I mean, the sages of the Talmud, the
Well,
Anoraim.
you determine they're wrong. I mean, like the name reform, like a reform criminal, reform implies that there was something wrong with Judaism that needed to be changed. And so if the majority of the Jews or the rabbis in America say, yes, you're right, Charles, that is historically our religion, but collectively as Jews, we decided that our ancestors are wrong. And democratically, we have changed that. So you could check our books. You could ask those Orthodox rabbis that are following that old stuff. But collectively, we decided our ancestors are wrong and
Right, and
move
we should
forward
have
in a
partial
different
birth
direction.
abortion, therefore. You know,
Well, yeah, I'm
look,
saying that's the reform that these are the issues that Jews
and by the
care
way,
about.
perhaps there are certain areas where the sages very well may have been wrong. I'm not here to say that they haven't been. That's what Responsa has been all about. But the point that I'm making here is that if you take a look, for example, at the Talmudic period, the Sanhedrin period, when you had a council of 71 Jews who sat in study of Jewish law and Torah, and yet at the same time were very well righteous characters in their own community. They were all married, they all had businesses, they all had trades, which, by the way, I think we can criticize some people today on the Orthodox side for that one. But the point is that they had a life that was rooted in the world, and at the same time, they worked very hard to try to understand what God was saying in the Torah. They tried to adhere to that as best they could. They drew from other people who were also sources on that. They drew from history, they drew from experience, they drew from faith. So if the reform movement wants to say, well, we think there's something wrong in the Torah after these many years, then I would hope that it would be based upon an attempt to try to understand the mind of God, not try to decide, well, this is popular right now, so we should have partial birth abortion. You know, it very well, they may discover an area where the Lord God, King of the universe, when he created man and we in his image, and when he created the moral order and the ethical order, that them, you know, they were imperfect. They weren't perfect people. They were not God. Maybe there is a way we can get closer somehow to what God had in mind, and we could therefore become more holy. If they're trying to do that, fine. If they're telling me that, that abortion is fine, I mean, I don't think so. I think that that's their opinion. They want to have it that way because it's popular right now. But it doesn't really comport to the Torah unless they can show me a way that it does. And I haven't seen that. You
So
know,
they don't
are
have to.
there,
I'm saying it's saying democratic, and it's saying the point is that collectively Jews saying like we're Jews, that's our history, that's where we come from, but we don't believe we believe that we're descendant of a false religion, and
let them
therefore
form
if
another
you want to
religion?
eat ham, that God does not care if you eat ham or not. Our ancestors, for whatever reason in the past, maybe it was logical, maybe it wasn't, thought that eating ham was bad. But it's like I'm part Cherokee, and if you told me like, how come you don't do those Cherokee customs? How come you don't do? Saying because I don't believe that they're true. I don't think I need to
Fine.
make a
Then
totem
let them
pole
form a new
and dance
religion.
around it. And you're saying that most Jews don't believe. Most Jews think that Judaism is a false religion, but they still want to gather as Jews and collectively have a spirit of Judaism and some spirit of that with putting that, yes, Charles, unfortunately, I mean, that's generally reform, the difference between reform and conservative, where Orthodox was, this is the word of God. Conservative is it was inspired by God. And reform is it's just our traditions and basically has nothing to do with God. And so if you're going to say
Well,
that's the opinion of the
I'm
majority
saying
of
that,
Jews,
you know,
that's the opinion of the majority of Jews in Israel also.
well, no, the majority of Jews in Israel, while they
Believe
may
that
not,
Judaism is a false religion. I mean, that's very clear.
well, whether they may not believe in God and
That
in
there's any
Judaism,
connection between Jewish
but
ritual
to
and
the
God. Well, I
degree,
mean, a false religion, God does not care whether you eat ham or not, or do any of these rituals. There's absolutely no connection between God, the creator of the world, and the observance of these rituals, and that like the reform held. And so let's just change it. And in Israel, that is unquestionably the majority
no, I
opinion
don't
of
think it
most.
is, and I'll tell you why I don't think so. The majority of Israelis may be secular, they may not be believers, but to the degree that they are, even if it's only a tiny degree, they do look to Orthodox Judaism. They're not interested in reform and conservative. Those are American things. I mean, they have never taken much of a foothold in Israel. They're there, They have the Mazorti synagogue in Jerusalem, and most of the people that go to that are Americans. It's not really an Israeli thing.
We
The
missed the
Israeli,
politics. We got a Reform rabbi now as the MK. If you saw the news this week, the Reform rabbi used his diplomatic immunity to smuggle in a Torah for women of the wall. And it was the first time ever, because it's the first time. There's been MKs that have done that in the past, but now, no, I mean, now there's a Reform rabbi who's a member of Knesset.
well, look, that I think that, by the way, that's a controversy that ought to be addressed by the rabbis in Israel and can be if under the proper venue.
Well, his position, he wants to eliminate those rabbis, saying, as someone who cares about Israel,
no, I'm
the
talking
main
about
thing that
the
Israel needs
Orthodox
to
rabbi.
do is eliminate the rabbinate.
I'm talking about the Orthodox chief rabbi, the offices of the sort of the ecclesiastical offices in Israel.
Yeah, so I think they want to eliminate that.
Who wants to eliminate it?
I think the position of the Reform MK is that they need to eliminate the rabbinate, not reform it.
Well, I think
But
that's.
I'm not exactly sure, and I might agree with that in the
I don't
sense that
agree.
we don't need an official, like America. We should have the open democracy of ideas and don't need to make orthodoxy official. And in Israel, that's democratic. The reason why orthodoxy is official is, like you said, is because that's democratic. The majority. I disagree that. I think most Israelis.
I don't think that comes out of Israel.
You're saying I'm a Jew. Like I don't
think
have
it
any
comes out of
doubt.
Israel as being a Jewish state.
But I'm saying Israelis, we know that we're Jews. We know our ancestors are Jews. We don't have any doubt about that. And most, know that historically Orthodoxy is representative of what Judaism was. But if you ask, do Israelis think that God, that there's any connection between God and our religion? Most Israelis say no. That like God doesn't care if you eat ham or not. You're saying, yeah, Orthodoxy, that's historically, that's what we wore. But like,
as I said, Dooovid, I don't want to talk around in circles here. Yes, I get that. Most Israelis, I don't know if I'd say most. I mean, I think many are probably atheistic somewhat, although I think if you really scratch below the surface, you might find otherwise.
You could still be spiritual,
but
and think
either
that
way,
God doesn't care whether
they
you eat
still
ham.
recognize Orthodox Judaism as normative Judaism, as Torah true Judaism. They don't look to Reform and conservative Judaism. I don't want to go. We've already gone over this twice. Let's move on. I mean, I think that I've made that statement. I think that's backed up by the actual, as the Israelis like to say, the facts on the ground in the state of Israel. And that this idea of like Reform and conservative, it's almost a very Protestant idea anyways, of denominations. That's an offshoot of the later part of the Enlightenment in Europe. And it's something that really mostly took root in the United States among Jews. So, it's an American phenomenon. And I'm, by the way, not suggesting that they're not Jewish or they're not authentic. I'm simply saying that when they go off the reservation and they start to regulate on things like allowing partial birth abortions, they are not really consistent with with Jewish understanding going all the way back to the days of Abraham. And if they can argue with me otherwise, fine. I haven't seen that. I just think that they think that, oh, well, we're a democracy. We can decide what Judaism is, whatever it fits our whim today. And I just
think they can't. And I'm saying, well, to some extent they can.
And I think that's a disservice, not only to Judaism as a whole, but to themselves. They should admit, hey, we're not observant. We're not as kosher as we should be. But let's not deny the fact that there are some basic principles, both in terms of practice and in terms of morals and ethics, that do make up a body of Judaism and that can be traced back to the days of Adam.
It's your word should, that's problematic. When you say, okay, like, did you put a tefillin on today? And you say, okay, that's my culture. It's respectable. It's a good thing that, we put on tefillin today or kept kosher, but should being like, no, there's no should that a Jew should keep kosher, because if the religion was false and our ancestors just did these customs because it was the best they could do with the time, then there's no should.
They have been done. And whether or not I put on a tefillin this morning, that's a private question, and I'm not going to answer
it. Because it should. You think whether the answer is yes or no, you say you should have. You agree that you should have.
No, I said that whether I did it or not, I recognize that is an ideal in Judaism. That's what Judaism teaches. I don't live up to that ideal completely. Nobody, I don't think anybody does completely. If we did,
Why
we'd be
can't you say
gone.
that's what our like if you were an Indian or something, that's what our ancestors did.
Well,
We should
if
respect the
I was a
customs of our
Cherokee, I
ancestors,
would
but our
respect them.
ancestors didn't know any better before the Industrial Revolution and the Enlightenment, and they did these ancient rituals that really don't do anything besides
Yeah, but I
respect
wouldn't
our
cancel them.
background.
No, they
And
did.
it's the
They
same
did.
thing
But
is about kosher. And the majority of American Jews, there is no should. You should
yes,
like if
there
you
is.
wanted to put on tefillin, I'm glad you did. But if
There
there
is
is
a
no
should.
God
And
that
you should
you're
admit that you're not doing it. Acknowledge it to yourself. Look at nobody's
Well, there's
perfect.
a point. You're saying,
I mean,
is it okay to admit that Judaism, unfortunately, Charles, I think Judaism is a false religion. Is that it?
then you're
Can me
outside
as
the
a Jew
pale of
say that?
Judaism. They can say it, but they'd be in heresy territory.
Why is it heretical? It's saying,
For the same reason that the
I looked
Catholics
into
said
it.
that
I
Jesus
love
wasn't
Judaism.
God.
I love Israel, but I think it's a false religion. I don't think that there's a
Well,
God.
then you'd be outside of the faith of Judaism. You'd be a heretic. Now, look, let me say something about this. It would be like a Catholic saying that Jesus is not God. I actually had a conversation about this with my conservative rabbi many years ago because I was involved in a controversy as a talk show host. I'm not going to get into it too deeply, but it ended up getting me on the cover of a newspaper and on television. It was like suddenly the doors open up, and it had to do with an argument, a public argument I had with the head of this group called Jews for Jesus. And, I basically said, look, he said, well, what am I? Aren't I a Jew? And I said, yeah, but you're also Christian in terms of belief, and that's fine. But don't pretend that this is Judaism. And, the rabbi explained to me what this was. And he said, look, somebody who is an atheist, someone who is not a believer, who doesn't believe that Judaism is a real thing, they still fall under the rubric of being a Jew because they're not actively, literally believing in another religion, in another God. But if someone becomes Christian or Muslim or something else, which is an active body of beliefs that contradicts the Jewish idea of the Lord God, King of the universe, then, excuse me, then they're heretics. Then they are in a state of apostasy. Now, in Judaism, if you do have that and you do become actively involved in a separate belief system, you don't have to undergo reconversion to come back. You can just come back. But nevertheless, you're actively engaging in and embracing a body of beliefs that are not consistent with the Jewish covenant, and therefore you're an apostate. And that's how he classified Jews who were involved with Jews for Jesus as apostates, but still Jewish. And I think that probably describes some Jews. I mean, I think most
You're
Jews
talking
don't.
about people looking for something else. You just say like a
Yeah, I
Reformed
mean,
Jew is saying, I'm just you're like,
no, but
I'm sad
Reformed
to
Jews
admit
are,
that I
no,
think we're
that
part of a false
I
religion.
did not
I'm
say
not
that
becoming
Reformed
Christian or
Jews
another
are
religion
apostates.
because
I
of
did
that. I
not
just say that
say that conservative Jews are apostates. They are Jewish actively. I also would not say that an atheist Jew is an apostate. That's my point. They're not apostates because they're not actively worshiping another form of God. In other words, if you worship no God, then you're not actively, it's a passive thing. Everyone struggles sometimes with the idea of God. It's a complicated thing. But if you're actively believing in another form of God, then you are an apostate. That does not describe conservative or Reformed Judaism. It doesn't describe atheism.
the difference in today's age, when our ancestors became conservative or reform, they were probably Orthodox, and they probably thought Orthodox Judaism is wrong, and it was really a war over the heart of Judaism. Today, the education level of Jews that became reform or conservative is so small, and the connection with the Orthodoxy is largely lost that people don't even know about Orthodoxy.
And
But
that's correct.
historically, my grandfather, who went to to Breslau, and got a job with the Workmen's Circle, and he probably, his father may have already been Reformed, but his father was Orthodox, and he intellectually decided that Orthodoxy is wrong and switched to Reform. And in the sense that you said that
I
no,
think what you're describing here, and this was described by the late Rabbi Marvin Anselman in his book To Eliminate the Opiate, which I recommend is an excellent book. And he said that, look, he said there really is no such thing as quote unquote Orthodox Judaism. It's just normative Judaism, Torah true Judaism. And this idea that there was a literal Orthodox movement was in a way a reaction to the Reform movement and then the conservative movement, which became like they were imitating Protestant churches at the time. They wanted to be like the Methodists or the Baptists. I even understand that. I think that.
Why don't we mention the Enlightenment? I was saying that with the Enlightenment,
All right.
the factual historical basis for being an Orthodox Jew was shattered, that no educated person who had read any of this philosophy in their right mind could possibly believe that any of this stuff is true.
Well, I mean, then we're talking about Spinoza, who, by the way, was excommunicated.
Well, I'm
Look,
talking about the
again,
reform that
yeah.
that
Well, but
in
I think
Germany
reform,
said that we don't want to return to Israel. We don't want to rebuild the temple,
something.
and that was heresy. It is heresy until today, and it's like Adam Green. Charles, do you want to rebuild the temple or not? I demand an answer. And so the reform would be like, no, I do not want to rebuild the temple.
Yeah,
I don't
but I
care
think
that my
look,
books and prayers say that.
I understand, but I think that in the overall picture, and again, I'm observing this as just a regular schmo out here, that the Reform movement still believes in God. They still believe in that the Torah was at least divinely inspired. They may not think it's the literal word of God, but I think that they believe enough to be within the fold of actively Jewish practice.
Maybe conservative. No, I mean, like reform is by definition, like Moses maybe didn't even exist. Saying like the hypothesis, Ezra, and even Israeli scholars, you're saying like, no, I mean, I would say even conservative, very few Jews think that God has anything to do with it. They say historically that this is our historical tradition. This is the way of our ancestors. But no, I mean, I think reform by definition is God's got nothing to do with it. You could be spiritual reform like a Freemason, that there is a God who cares about morality and ethics, and there's beauty to our tradition. And like Benjamin Disraeli, when our ancestors when were priests in King Solomon's temple, that relatively compared to what's going around in the world, that being priest in King Solomon's temple and slaughtering animals sounds pretty bad, but relatively that was probably pretty good compared to the times. And you're saying like, no, that's a bunch of ridiculous nonsense that our ancestors did because they didn't know any better. And the reform, at least historically, had the balls to say that and saying, I'm still a Jew. I don't hate Jews. I want to organize and still be Jewish, but I'm willing to admit that our ancestors were just wrong and mistaken.
By the way, Dooovid,
and you're saying, oh, you're a heretic.
No, as I said, Reform Jews are not heretics. Now,
well, it is heresy. It's like, no, I mean, factually, it's like that was
heresy. They may
was,
not be recognizing certain things, but that doesn't mean that they're actively supporting something else. If they don't recognize the divinity of Moses or his prophecy, fine, but they're not recognizing Baal.
No, so you don't have to come on to idol worship or a false religion to be a heretic. Just rejecting the principles of Judaism makes you a heretic. If you don't believe in Messiah or resurrection of the dead, you're a heretic, according to our book.
I'm going with my conservative rabbi on that one. You're not a heretic unless you actively believe in something.
Yeah, but that's not what the Talmud says. The Talmud says you're a heretic if you don't actively believe in the resurrection of the dead.
All right, fine. I want to just briefly change the subject because this makes me think of something else. I'm about to finish my most recent book, which is a sequel to my book about God, and that is a book about Satan. And when I say Satan, I don't mean the Christian vision of the devil with the red hat and the tail. I'm talking about the philosophical nature of evil and how it's influencing society and it's influencing people and it's force in the world.
I have to look. I'm pretty sure I have a book on the history of Satan.
Do you? Well,
I have to check to see the title, but I'll forward that to you later.
Okay, Jeff, I forget what I was going to say here.
You told me you're thinking of writing a book on Satan.
No, I am writing it. I'm about
to finish
writing it, but I was going to use that to make a point about what we were just talking about.
In terms of heresy, whether you have to believe in something wrong or just rejecting the positive things, like saying you don't have to become Christian or worship Baal.
I now know.
Heretic.
Thank you.
I
now know what I was
going to say. Resurrection of the
dead
or Messiah makes us a heretic.
One of the things that I studied to finish this book was I did a pretty careful reading, a secular reading, admittedly, a Pashat reading, as they might say, of the book of Leviticus, because I think that Leviticus is one of those parts of the Torah that really contains the Jewish philosophy, if you will. And, it's what E. Michael Jones calls logos. It really contains that part of the Torah. Yeah, it's not that it's in other parts, but it has that. And one of the things that I came across in my reading, and again, this is a very superficial mind here, I'm not a rabbi, was that, and this contradicts the Christian idea, by the way, was that the business of animal sacrifice, the business of, and all of the intricate rules around that, and the Leviticus has all of that, that there is nothing in the Talmud that says that this is required. It says, when you read the sentences that talk about it, and again, I'm reading King James, I'll admit, because I like the literary element of it. It says, if you are to do this animal sacrifice, this is how God wants it done, and this is where the type of animal and the type, blah, blah, blah. But it doesn't say you have to do it. There's nothing in there that requires that as a way to believe in God. Now, maybe on this issue, I actually agree with Reform Judaism, in that it was done at the time because it enhanced belief in God, and it brought, this is how humanity worshiped at that time. And to do that increased a closeness to God. But it's not something, and it's something that we ought to look to as an ideal. And there's a lot of very good values in there in terms of purity and rightness, and setting an extremely high standard for goodness and for doing right. But to literally do that is not something that's required. And this is something that I think is a misunderstanding on the part of Christians, quite frankly. I don't know how far I want to go into this, but they believe that Jesus was the last sacrifice according to Saint Athanasius, who put that into the Nicene Code, or the Nicene, whatever, the meeting in Nicaea. And that replaced the need to do sacrifice, because then the temple was destroyed. And that therefore Judaism has been replaced, because we no longer are doing these animal sacrifices at a temple. By the way, the Torah doesn't even mention temple. That's something that came later, that came under King David.
I mean, Moses, the Torah included, it's in Joshua and Kings and...
No, it talks about the tabernacle, but it doesn't talk about building a temple in Jerusalem. It only...
Well, you mean Moses. Obviously, the Torah includes the Joshua and King Solomon.
No, the Tanakh includes Joshua and Solomon, but the Torah, the 5 scrolls of Moses, what we have in our synagogue, that does not include those things. Those are the writings.
When we have in our synagogue all the prophets, not just Moses. We read a Haftorah. We read a Haftorah. Like after the Torah, we read the Haftorah.
But do we read it out of the Torah?
Well, that's actually a dispute whether you're supposed to have.
We don't read it out of the Torah.
Well, that's a dispute. In some synagogues, they do have the prophets written on scrolls. Most synagogues, you don't read the prophets from a scroll. But I think Torah...
The scroll contains the 5 books, what Christians call, and accurately, the 5 books of Moses. It's not the prophets. It's not the writings. We read those. That's the Haftorah, which means it's a supplement to the Torah.
Yeah, but I'm saying God spoke to the prophets that built the temple. That, according Moses might not have mentioned, but according it's Torah because God spoke to our prophets who built our temple.
Okay, but look, the point I'm making is that there's nothing in
Moses.
To get back to my point, there's nothing in Moses, and there's nothing in all of the regulations around animal sacrifice and temple worship that is required. And that Christians believe that because we can't do animal sacrifice anymore, therefore our religion has been replaced by theirs, because they had the final sacrifice, and that was Jesus himself. That it's a brilliant idea, but it is not consistent with the Jewish understanding of Torah. And I'm not here to dispute that. That's a Christian belief, and I respect it. But the thing that struck me when I was reading Leviticus is that there actually is no hard requirement to do the animal sacrifice. Because if you look at the language in Hebrew, I'm pretty sure, but certainly in English, it says that if you do the sacrifice, this is how you do it. So that's all. I just wanted to share that as a thought. Maybe some of our listeners may have some insight on that one. I'm
You
not
don't have to go with Adam Green on that and saying like we follow the Talmud and the rabbis, not the scripture. So it doesn't matter whether you're right or wrong about what the scripture says. As Orthodox Jews, like you're not going to like we go with what the rabbis and the
we
Talmud.
go with what the rabbis say. And by the way, the rabbis in the Talmud, there is, I mean, the Talmud is not, I don't think the Talmud, I think it's generally been acknowledged by the rabbis that the Talmud is not exactly at the same spiritual level as either the Torah or the writings of prophets.
Yeah, not all. I mean, like you said, Moses is the key of all prophets. Law is derived from Moses. The other
Right.
prophets we could learn from, and there's lessons. But Moses himself says that after he passes, I have to look up the verse that Judaism will be ran, through a democratic process of the sages of the generation. And so whether
That's right.
Moses says it or not, you're saying that Moses told you to follow the sages of the generation. So you don't, as a Jew,
No,
if
I
you want to
do.
follow Moses, you don't follow Moses, you follow the sages of the generation.
Yeah, but
because
the
that's what
sages
Moses
of the
told us to do.
generation, and by the way, Moses did set up in a way the world's first separation of powers when he took the advice of his father-in-law, Jethro.
Yeah, I mean, Perk Moses taught the Torah to Joshua and the elders
Yeah,
taught
but
it.
also he set up a council of elders in his own lifetime that would handle and adjudicate, conflict and law, and that they were, and that is in the Torah, and that they are, the equivalent idea of like a separate judiciary. I mean, this is
I mean, saying like, as a Jew, you should ask your local, say Orthodox rabbi. If you don't believe in Orthodoxy, you should ask you don't look and read Moses to determine what you do. You ask your local rabbi.
Yeah, but you
and saying because Moses himself says that's what we're supposed to do.
Yeah, but he also, I mean, I again,
I'm saying don't read Moses. Obviously, it's
no.
it's a respectable, good Jewish thing to have Moses memorized, but we follow our rabbis, not Moses.
But I understand also, and again, I can't quote it. I'll have to maybe do a little deeper dive here. But I think that Moses did not suggest that, therefore, in future generations, these rabbis would contradict the moral and ethical precepts of Sinai. That
what
gives them their authority is the fact that they try to adhere, even if it may contradict previous generations to various extents. They try to adhere to the ethical precepts of Sinai because that's what God gave the world. So if I have a rabbi now who says, well, post-abortion is fine, I want to know where do they get their authority to say that? I mean, from people because it's popular, because the majority of Jews in the democratic world. No, they have to get their authority from going back.
My grandfather he studied in the Rabbinic Institute in Breslau, not Breslau, but and that was at the time the most respected rabbinic training center in Europe outside of Orthodoxy.
It was respected because it adhered to the laws of Moses to a higher degree.
Well, no, it was reform, and that was where Gretz. I mean, my grandfather probably studied under Gretz.
Under Heinrich Gretz.
Yeah, I think he was there. I mean, he was a professor at the.
Was he? Okay, well,
my grandfather's grandfather, and saying that's why he got. The workman's circle didn't hire an Orthodox rabbi; they hired an alumni of the Breslau Academy that studied under Gretz.
I have read you probably have read also at least some of Heinrich Gretz's classic encyclopedic history of Judaism. And yeah, it leans in a little bit in the Enlightenment department, but he doesn't contradict the rabbis either. I mean, he actually takes a look at, and I'm saying this as in that I have read in his work, and it's brilliant. He takes a look at what the rabbis were thinking. He doesn't try to deviate just because, well, in our generation, we can do whatever we want. He tried to be consistent to a basic set of principles. He might have tried to interpret them in a way that fit the time, but he didn't deviate. He didn't go off too far. He tried to homogenize them and synthesize them with the basic faith. So if someone's going to tell me that, abortion after the birth is fine and that's perfectly Jewish, and that if you disagree with me, you're an anti-Semite, which is something that the ADL might say, then I say a pox on their house, because you have to have.
Saying it's a war between Orthodoxy and the majority of American Jews. I mean, saying Jonathan Greenblatt and the Federation are largely fighting Orthodox Judaism on behalf of the majority of American Jews, because that's what American Jews
Well,
want their leaders to do. They
and
want
that
the
shows that
leaders
we're
to
having a
step up
civil war.
and
I
say,
think
these
that's
Orthodox rabbis don't represent us. These are our representatives. I mean, you disagree that the essential purpose largely is to have these respected Jewish leaders that are going to be able to speak against what the
respected.
Orthodox rabbis say.
Look, I mean, they derive, if they're deriving their authority, and to a certain extent they do, from the Torah and from an honest and unvarnished interpretation of Torah, then maybe they don't agree with the Orthodox rabbis. But the point is that when they deviate from that to such an extent that anything goes, and it becomes, taking positions that have nothing to do with either the, or contradict the Torah, then they don't. Anyways, Dooovid, we reached toward the end of the program. I just want
we have to think about the role of democracy in Judaism. So I mean, if you you're saying Judaism's not a democracy.
Yes, I am.
And I don't disagree. I was just pushing back to make it an interesting conversation.
All right. I just want to finish by changing the subject a little bit, because you're involved in and you're close to Michigan politics as a guy who lives in Detroit, and you know people like you've hung out with Rashida Tlaib and some others.
Jocelyn Benson,
yes.
Well, Rashida Tlaib, I actually spoke to. Jocelyn Benson, I couldn't get within 20 feet of.
Really? I'm sure. She probably took a look at you and didn't want to talk to you.
Well, no, I mean, there were police there. I'm saying, like, I saw Jocelyn Benson. There were billionaires and police there. I couldn't get close to her. Rashida Tlaib, I got right up to and spoke to her, and she was nice to me.
Oh, well, that's nice. Just take a look at her comments about the Holocaust. Anyway, I don't want to talk about that. I'm bringing this up because I want to try to euphemistically talk about a taboo subject, one that could get me shut down on YouTube. And that is the recent events of the first Tuesday of last November. We know what happened on that day, right? We know that there was a national event. I don't want to say what it was, but it involved candidates. And now you have this young lawyer in Michigan, DePerno. I don't know if you know who he is.
No, you have to tell me.
Okay.
I don't follow a huge amount of Michigan politics.
He's representing.
I read the newspaper, so it could be I just missed it.
He's representing several elected state representatives who are contesting elements of what happened on that day, and things that had to do with the electronic.
Yeah, they didn't put that in. They didn't put that in the Detroit papers. You have to form me a blog, because that's not appearing in the Detroit papers. I can't
talk about it, but it appeared in papers in Antrim County. I can't talk too bluntly here because, again, I'm going to get shut down. But he's issued this report, which has discovered that certain electronic devices, shall we say, that were spinning around on the time of the events of the first Tuesday of November were functionally online when they were functioning, which is a contradiction to what Jocelyn Benson, Secretary of State, said. She said that these devices were not online. And his report indicates that they were, and the fact that they were meant that they were receiving feedback from whomever, could have been anyone in the state, and that if they were online, it meant that others in other counties other than Antrim County, which have not been investigated, probably were also online. And that the fact that they were online brings up a question of whether or not somebody from outside of that district, or even outside this country for that matter, might have entered or taken out certain pieces of data that might have affected the appearance of what they eventually told us happened on that day. I don't want to say more about it because I'll get taken off YouTube. What I would suggest as a good source of information on this subject is a very good publication you can look at online called The Gateway Pundit. I don't know if you've heard of it. Check it out. Jim Hoff.
When I mentioned this Ron Wiesner, the updates in that case, maybe it's related, and say no one wants to talk about what you're talking, even if you're right. The powers that be, you're going to have an extremely hard time talking about that. I think Ron Wiesner, who I mentioned, had made those possibly threatening statements about the governor and the three, God forbid, we called the three witches of.
Three witches. I don't think he was threatening them. He just made a
Well, I mean,
very.
he said something that was, he said something that could have been condoned as a threat. So just to update, and is related to what you're saying,
Okay.
he was um, voted sixth on the University of Michigan, where I went to school, alumni, great school. He's on the elected Board of Regents, which has 8 members, and they censured him. They said that they
Yeah, I
want
know
him to
that.
resign, and
He
they
didn't
stripped
resign,
him
did he?
of. Well, he refused to resign. He said he won't be canceled, and um, and he's actually donated tens and tens, maybe even more than $100 million to the university. But he has basically been shut down. He has been stripped of his appointments. Even the building, I think I'm not sure if they were able to take the name off the building that he donated.
Yeah.
But just to
That's
say
how they
how
roll.
testy, and this man's a Jew, and like in his opinion, he was talking about Nazi Germany in his opinion for what he was defending. But I mean, it's just a sign of the issue that
Of how
that
totalitarian
you
that
can't
state.
even talk about.
Oh,
And
I know.
I have no way to verify whether what you're saying is
Well,
true or
what I'm
not. And I'm
saying
a
is that,
skeptic of the system. I just mentioned the Ron Weisner because we talked
no,
about
we
that.
have, and
I mean, that man's a billionaire. That man has given
and he's
huge
been
amounts
canceled.
of charity, and he has largely been canceled. Besides the fact that they can't legally cancel him, but like just like said, like no paper that I saw is carrying these articles about what you mentioned.
No, they're
And
not.
Ron
They're blackout.
Wiesner is like he's
People
the
are
most
afraid,
despicable man in all of Michigan, according to the papers.
according to these Nazi-like figures that
I
run
may
the
use
state.
a negative term to describe it. I would say like I'm looking at both sides as rational actors, and maybe it's rational to destroy your enemy. So I'm not going to call bad names on either side, but say like
I
Charles is
am.
right. You can, but yeah, I mean, I'm not saying that you shouldn't be able
It's
to. It's
very,
not.
when I say that, I mean that the state is really under a very totalitarian oriented regime right now, and that the truths around the events of that day are being suppressed, in my opinion.
Well, it's
Check
falling
out,
apart now with Whitmer
check
and
out the Gateway Pundit to get more information.
just because you
Michigan
asked
is
about Michigan,
I
saying
think that Michigan, the truth is going to come out. It may take a year, it may take 2 years, but eventually and slowly, drip by drip by drip, the truth about what happened on that day in that state is going to come out because the truth will prevail and the truth will set you free. That's
amen.
all I want to say about it. I can't get into the details.
Well, just to mention the elections. I mean, it'll probably only
Oh,
change
don't say that word.
when Dana Nessel is defeated and there's a new attorney
God willing.
general
God
who's
willing.
willing to look into it.
Yeah.
And just think in Michigan with we have the worst COVID-19 outbreak since the pandemic. The infection rates is higher.
Why is that? Because you think
Well,
Michigan is the kind of state that, at least from what I'm
Well, I just
from the
mentioned
governor,
related to what you were asking,
it's the
and
most
Governor Whitmer no longer has the
intensely
power to
shut
close down
down.
the state. All
Yeah,
the
but
doctors and experts are saying shut it down, and Whitmer has basically lost credibility where she
well,
doesn't have the
nobody's going to
power
go along
to
with it.
shut it down anymore,
I don't
even
think
though the
people.
doctors and
Yeah, but
CDC.
people aren't going to tolerate that again. But the point is that
Well, I was saying,
Michigan,
so what you're saying might be true, but it's probably going to take the replacement of
it's
Whitmer
going to
and
take.
Nessel to even have an investigation. But just saying with the
No, the
COVID-19 right
investigation
now,
is
Whitmer
going
is
on.
becoming less and
Take
less
a look at the
popular.
state. Look at the Michigan.
She's losing control among the left right now because she's refusing to put us back
Okay,
in
good.
lockdown.
Yeah, but the point is that, first of all, look at what the state legislature is doing in terms of investigating the events of the first November Tuesday of November. It's out there. It's bubbling to the surface. And as far as like a shutdown of the state, I just don't think that people are going to tolerate that right now. And I wonder why it is that Michigan, of all places, given the fact that if I believe the governor, if I look at how things went there, you have people wearing 2, 3, 4 masks and never going out. Why are they having a surge in COVID-19 cases?
I could tell me because you just go out and saying because people aren't capable of social distancing. We had a big lockdown. A lot of people were virtue signaling against Trump, and it was really cold. So when we had the big outbreak in January, February, people weren't really going anywhere because it's cold. So now it's warmed up, and there's still 70% of the population that's unvaccinated, and everybody, including the liberals, are tired of social distancing and wearing masks.
Okay.
And the Tigers are playing, and the restaurants are full, and so I mean just on the pure science. That's why the outbreak is you can't convince, like no one wants to wear, even the governor. And if she were just straight up and said it, she's like, look, you had your chance. We vaccinated the people most at risk, and now we're going to open up and we're just going to roll with it. But I mean, she's more not being straightforward and honest, saying like, well, the seniors and the people most at risk got the vaccine. So now we're just going to have to care more about the economy because we already protected the people who are most at risk. And I would maybe scientifically accept that, but that's not what she's saying. And you're probably right that there's probably, I mean, God forbid, I have no way to know this, but I mean, you could be right about the election stuff. And it could be that, they're going to keep on doubling down and try to cover it up. But the way the U.S. politics works is Dana Nessel is going to have to be attorney general, is an elected office, and she's the attorney general, and it's the spoil system. And unlikely until she's replaced that the attorney general is or
you're
Benson
right.
are going to do
but
anything.
whether or not she's replaced, and I hope they all are, but even if they're not, the truth is still bubbling out, and you can't hide it forever. Anyway, Dooovid, listen, where can people watch your excellent show?
Yeah, I'm doing a bunch of different streams. I'm hardly putting out content. I got the Week in Review of Church of Entropy Sundays. I think Lowell Gallon, hopefully I'll be streaming with him. Like it's his program, so I'm just a guest, so long term, but I streamed today and, it was Monday and Wednesday. I'm not sure if it's Tuesday and Thursday or the schedule, but people follow me on Facebook or Twitter. I post that. Unfortunately, I'm not like Charles who, has back talk show host. I more only put out, research. So right now I don't have anything to put out. So I'm only appearing on other channels. And I appreciate Charles having me on to talk. And I respect Charles that he's willing to, do what I can't do, just to talk every day, with people. And, but different people have our different, benefits and lackings. And, that's why we team up. Brundle in the chat here is like, he keeps on saying Dooovid won. As like, I'm not trying to beat you, Charles. Like I'm trying to, use the Pilpul Judaic method to get at truth. And it may appear to an outsider like it's a personal argument.
No, not at all. In fact, I have a funny TikTok here right now. I'll just read it. I must research why a ham sandwich is against God. I've eaten my weight in ham and cheese. Now, I have a feeling this person is not Jewish, at least based on their name and appearance. Anyways, Dooovid.